When I went home for about 3 weeks, maybe a month and a half ago, my dad decided that we should do a bit of night fishing. I'm not a huge fan of night fishing, or any sort of fishing in general, or even my dad for that matter. The reason being is because our personalities are way too similar, and if you leave us together for more than an hour, there may be blood left over by the time he and I are done playing several rounds of fisticuffs between the stubborn arguing and shouting. Anyways, Dad decided to take me up this river by our new house that they just finished building. My mom and brother stayed behind as we traipsed through the dark woods. Now, my family lives in Oregon, and the river was about 1.5 miles in my family's property over massive fallen trees and stumps that I easily tripped on, not really knowing the lay of the land. My dad merely scoffed at me and reminded me that city living makes me soft. He didn't say it just like that, but something along those lines. Like some stereotypical cowboy out of an old Wild West film. I blamed the fact that I didn't know the area as well as he did, and it just spiraled downhill from there. And arguing broke out between us, making the peaceful night loud and chaotic. We didn't stop arguing the entire way down the river, with my father critiquing my less than Christian lifestyle, while I criticized his manner of parenting my 20-year-old autistic brother. When we got to the river, we finally settled into an awkward, tense silence as we got our gear out. I knew that this was far from over as I sat down on a fallen stump and shivered my ass off. I had lived in a warm climate for over a year, and honestly, coming out here is probably him punishing me for even leaving the Pacific Northwest. We refused to talk to one another as our bobbers danced across the water when my dad suddenly stood up, his light landing on the other side of the river. And that's when I saw it. There on the other bank stood a man looking right at us. He wore a bright orange t-shirt and a pair of scraggly jeans, but for the most part looked pretty average, if you counted the machete hanging from his belt. My dad snapped at me to start packing all of our stuff up, so I followed his command as my dad started shouting at the man across the river. Their conversation was mostly lost to the roar of the white-capped water, but I could see the man making agitated sweeps with his hands every time I dared to peek. Their voices grew and my fear grew with it. My father has never been one to carry protection in the woods, hence why I was born. This man was armed and possibly dangerous with that machete, and while we had the river between us, it was shallow and had plenty of places to cross. I had absolutely no doubt that this man could be behind us in mere minutes. Had we wandered onto his property by mistake and just not have known it? Drop the gear and let's go. My dad snarled at me as I took one last look up to see the man starting to walk into the water, with the stranger's hand sitting against his weapon. My dad put a firm hand on my shoulder and led me back into the woods towards our house. My dad is an ultramarathon runner. He runs like it's going out of style, and my mostly out-of-shape self probably wouldn't have kept up if I hadn't been so terrified. I couldn't hear if the man was coming after us, my heartbeat being so loud in my ears, but I followed my dad so closely I almost ran into him several times. Finally, we found our road and made a break for my parents' house. As soon as we were through the front door, my dad had the doors locked and was keeping a vigilant watch out the windows, making sure no crazy man with a machete was creeping up on our house. Finally, when he figured there wasn't anyone to worry about, we sat down and began to talk about our experience with my mom. We avoided the part where we had been arguing, but told her everything else. We went to bed that night without apologizing, and I honestly felt horrid. The next day, with the only gun he owned, my father and I walked back out into the woods after calling the police. They said that there was a guy who did enjoy scaring people off of forest land in the area, and that we shouldn't be too concerned. Feeling a bit concerned, we went back to the place where we had left our gear, both of us apologizing for our lackluster behavior the night before. When we returned to what we believed to be the spot, we saw that our fishing poles had been bent and all the line had been draped from tree to tree, and the tackle box was gone. However, my dad and I didn't fight for the rest of the walk home. Thanks for bringing a temporary truce between me and my dad, crazy man, but let's never meet by the river again. On hot summer nights, predatory catfish are very active, and apparently so are creepy stalkers. A few years ago, while fishing with some friends at a well-frequented but poorly lit catfishing hotspot, our night was about to be totally ruined by some weirdo. I was a little bit tipsy, gathering firewood, and my buddy was smoking a cigarette, watching the tips of our poles for a bite. The girls had just squatted to pee nearby, and we were enjoying our little campfire. By no coincidence, a strange man calmly and almost silently walked up to our group. He came from the pitch black, as if he'd been lurking or watching us from afar. His mannerisms were very deliberate, as if he were somehow in control of the situation. My buddy gave him the cold shoulder, but I tried making nervous small talk with the stranger. I assumed that he was also a fisherman, looking for info on what was biting. No, he seemed totally indifferent to any talk about fishing, and he certainly didn't sense the emotional mood of the group toward him. The girls were definitely creeped out and nervous. At an awkward lull in the conversation, the stranger pulled out a large hunting knife and rubbed his thumb across the blade in like a self-soothing way. I assumed maybe he was a lonely vet, nothing more. But abruptly, my buddy started packing up all of our gear and turned ice cold. I remember the stranger getting a head start, leaving on foot somewhere ahead of us. I'll never forget the car ride home. My buddy and his wife explained that they had actually encountered that creep at a fishing spot before and shrugged him off with some disinterested small talk, and upon leaving for a short errand, they realized the creep followed them to the store and appeared in the aisle that they were headed for. My buddy was visibly shook up by this last encounter, and it put a damper on a favorite hangout of ours, and I'm pretty sure he followed us home that night as well. I read people quite well, and there was a definite subtext to the uncanny conversation I had with this guy. Looking back, it seemed like he had something welling up inside of him that he was alluding to. Perhaps a bit of self-restraint toward us, but certainly not mercy or empathy. I followed his train of thought, and it seemed like he had an air of accomplishment and physical dominance over the group. There were some other highly specific circumstantial aspects of the encounter that led me to believe that this guy could have been a murderer. I don't want to get into specifics, but this guy was hands down the creepiest person I've ever met. There are several cold cases of dead or missing women with a 200-mile radius of here. He had all the cold mannerisms of a complete sociopath. After almost 10 years, I can't shake the feeling that if we met again, I'd be brutally murdered. When I was about 7 years old, my father bought a few hundred acres in southern Mississippi, about 1.5 hours away from Mobile, Alabama. He built a small cabin on top of a hill that was in the middle of a large field surrounded by woods. This house was about 5 miles from a paved road. To get to our land, it took nearly 10 minutes of driving down dirt roads from the main highway, which was south of the house. About a quarter mile north from the house, he built a small lake, more like a pond. It was about as long as a football field but wider. To get to the lake from the house, you could take Route A, which was a hard-packed dirt road that was lined with dogwood trees. It was beautiful in the spring. Route B was about 100 yards east of Dogwood Lane, and we named it Vampire Trail because it was always so gloomy. The trees blocked out the sun even on the brightest days, and it had a slight decline as you walked toward the lake. One morning during fall, my parents and my little sister had gone to get ice cream and do some shopping. This trip would take them maybe 2 hours. I was 10 years old, and I decided to go fishing while listening to Bama play Ole Miss. The game was the usual Bama win, so I thought I could ease the boredom of a blowout by fishing in the well-stocked lake. So I carried my pole, small radio, and my small ice chest. I had a terrier named Bully that never left my side, and it was on this day that I realized how awesome he really was. Onto the lake we went. Picture a large oval, roughly the size of a football field, but larger with an L-shaped pier in the southeast corner. Vampire Lane opened up to a more severe decline to the shore, and then the small pier. Across the lake on the west side, there was a narrow tree line that separated the shore from Dogwood Lane. The north side of the lake was the dam, and the south ended in thick and swampy woods. Fortunately for me, I realized later. About 5 minutes after I threw out my line, and 2 Bama touchdowns later, I got that feeling. It's a feeling I have come to recognize well, and it may have saved my life this day. The feeling of being watched by someone dangerous. Bully must have felt it too, because a few seconds later, I could hear him growling low and staring across the lake to the west. All the way over to the tree line that separated Dogwood Lane from the lake. I turned my head in that direction, and almost immediately my eyes were lit on what I thought to be a half silhouette of a large man behind a tree. It was too far to make out details, but close enough to be sure of what I was seeing. About 5 minutes went by, and right before I scolded myself for an overactive imagination, the half silhouette moved behind a tree slowly. Bully stood and growled louder, and I told him quietly to stop. I turned my head north, towards the dam, while keeping my eyes and attention rooted to that tree. Over the next 10 minutes, which felt like hours, I watched while this figure moved slowly from tree to tree, always north and always facing me. The saying "scared stiff" was something I found to be true. For some reason, I thought it was important that whoever or whatever it was did not know I was aware. I finally realized that the figure's path was bringing it closer to the dam, which would make its path to me shorter and easier. My paralysis broke, and I casually put down the fishing pole, and I started walking towards Vampire Lane. As an adult, I was in the army for 11 years as an MP, but not turning to look over my shoulder during that walk was the hardest thing I have ever done. In my mind's eye, whatever it was screaming across the dam towards me. When I hit the tree line, I broke into a full-on run. As I was running, Bully dashed ahead of me, and my anger turned into admiration as he stopped some 20 yards ahead and then faced north until I passed him. He continued this action the entire run home. My dog was watching my back. That was just epic. Although I can grasp the awesomeness of this now, at the time I was so scared that I was literally sick. Even at such a young age, I knew that a large man watching and trying to creep up on a 10-year-old boy was up to no good. When I reached the cabin, I immediately locked the door and got one of my dad's shotguns, as well as his .38 revolver. I sat at the large front window with my eyes glued to both trail openings and the woods between them. My family returned shortly after this, and for some reason, I didn't mention what happened. I never felt safe there again. When me and my friends or my little sister wanted to go anywhere other than the area around the cabin, I made sure my parents were with us. What scares me the most, though, is the fact our closest neighbors were about 2 miles northwest of us, with thick woods in between. Who or what in the hell was watching me from the woods that day? Guess I may never know. I sometimes wish I could go back there as a grown man with my military training as I am now. Bully lived a full life and was put to sleep peacefully as a very old but great dog. The best dog I have ever known.